Hello, everyone, and welcome to At Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer, and welcome to our guest, Jeffrey Sonnenfeld, professor at the Yale School of Management, which is Yale's Graduate School of Business. Jeffrey, so great to see you.
It's great to see you again, Andy.
So I sort of short-shrifted you with your title and your responsibilities. You do a lot of things here at SOM, as the school is known. Talk about what you do and what your mandate here is.
Well, actually, I appreciated the shorter introduction. Sometimes you get that fulsome introduction and you see about a third of the crowd is already turned off. In fact, I start to dislike myself a bit sometimes when you read the whole bio out. But and the list of titles is almost a fold-out business card, I think. I have a senior associate deanship. I created the executive programs in the school. It was wonderful. It was sort of a tabula rasa as a blank slate of executive programs that weren't there. Many other schools went into kind of feeding the fire of middle management programs that sometimes weren't making a lot of money, and it was very hard, and they were getting into a lot of cliched things that could be taught more cheaply by people that were not professors elsewhere. So we never got into all that, so we were able to create something fresh, a start, as a high-end effort. That's one thing, that senior associate deanship. The other one is the Lester Crown Professor of Leadership Practice, and what's really great about that is Lester Crown, of course, is a legend in himself. Who the family, and he had led General Dynamics and a whole portfolio of other businesses, as you know, Chicago-based, really philanthropic company. But if you're in the leadership arena and your chair is the Crown Chair, that sounds very regal. It sounds like a throne itself. And then the third piece of the puzzle is I'm the president of the Yale Chief Executive Leadership Institute. That is something so shriekingly obvious. You would have thought some enterprising dean would have created it long ago. And as you know, that even predates my time here at Yale. I was back, and even at Emory. This just takes me back to Harvard. I had written a book that did it unexpectedly well. For about 11 seconds was a bestseller called The Hero's Farewell, Oxford University Press book, that studied the exit of a whole generation of CEOs and taking a look across disciplines from folklore and mythology to labor economics and things, and their predecessors or successors, a great generation that Brokaw later discovered. And that book seemed to spark a lot of interest in the exiting incumbents, and they were looking for a place to go to school. So we created the world's first school for incumbent CEOs, and it seems audacious, but even Klaus Schwab hopefully would admit it was before the World Economic Forum was founded, Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, CNBC, Bill Gates, Microsoft. I helped all of them get into that space. Even your old friends back in the days of Fortune, we had Marshall Loeb there at the time to ring an old bell, and and the publisher at that time, who was there's an Atlanta-based publisher, remember, and they all thought, you have the unguarded ear of the CEO. This kid doesn't really. So those are the three areas.
Yeah, I guess the latter one is sort of speaks to your reputation as a CEO whisperer a little bit. Now, SOM is a little bit different from other business schools like Harvard, where you got your MBA, and Wharton, Stanford, et cetera. How is it different?
Well, it was created in the earliest days by people interested in the classics. The president of the university at the time was a classicist and thought there should be a regular gathering of people interested in leadership and management issues. He wasn't sure if it should be a school in itself. A great leadership scholar, Victor Vroom, a psychologist, really started to put it together, and it was a strange mix with the psychologists and with the operations research people, because they actually had been working together, believe it or not, back into the 1930s. A lot of the work on mass persuasion, mass communications, and things were part of that group. They had the notion of the sleeper effect and groupthink stuff that came out. These were areas that came from this group, and they wound up forming a school of management, and then had to figure out how we get accountants and finance people and operations people. That was the origin, but they wanted to be taking a look at social impact, that doing good was not antithetical to doing well, and that was its origins. And we've fortified that in more recent years.
Right. So how did you get interested in this business of management and CEOs? I mean, some kids, when they are young, they want to grow up to be firemen. I mean, did you want to do this when you were a little kid? How did you evolve into thinking about this
This
stuff?
is just like you. Nobody ever asks me this. So here you have it raw, unrehearsed, unvarnished. Is I in Harvard College was president of the campus radio station. It was easier to get into a leadership role than it was at the contentious Harvard Crimson, which I never would have had a chance at. And I loved it, and it was a lot of fun. We had presidents and vice presidents resigning. We had the horrible Middle Eastern War at that time, Yom Kippur War. We had tremendous resources around as to make national and international news using the Harvard talent. So I loved that, but it didn't seem like it was serious because I was actually a closet pre-med at the time, and my family had been in the men's clothing business, a small retail, and I thought, really get away from business and try to get into something cerebral. I was going to be a physician. I was actually interested in psychiatry, but so much of it seemed that the people who needed it the most seemed to get it the least, and vice versa. I was having misgivings, and working as a volunteer at Mass General in the emergency ward, I loved just the way things functioned as an institution. My parents were both very ill throughout my life, and many times I had them both in the hospital at the same time in the Philadelphia area. And at nights, I'd been running the family clothing store in high school and stuff with help, and but I didn't realize that could be an occupation. And the hospitals, Mass General in particular, but the Boston hospital was so different than at that time. The Philadelphia hospitals, there just was a lot of anger, and my mom had a lot of malpractice problems, and it didn't seem like that in Boston. So I thought institutionally, I really was interested in that. I took a very easy course called Human Behavior and Organizations, taught by a guy named Jay Lorsch, a professor at Harvard. I couldn't believe that people got course credit. The stuff seemed so obvious and fun and having impact. So I wound up switching over when I learned that you not only get course credit for it, there's a whole field of study, and in fact, you can actually make a living doing it. So that was it. So I got my MBA and my doctorate at Harvard, and then joined the faculty for a decade. And so that's how I got into it. And my parents had just always been active politically on losing causes and failing candidates. And I thought if I could marry that political interest with business, and that's sort of what got me into this arena of governance.
Interesting. So, CEOs and society today, I mean, you could argue very strongly it's never been more fraught. Let's just take societal issues, political issues. This whole idea, this whole notion, Jeff, of when to speak out and when not to speak out. How do business leaders decide?
Uh, Again, sensational question, and it's very well timed because there seems to be a bit of a seesaw of sorts as to what pressures CEOs are under. If we go back just to our youth, when you were back here in New Haven as a child yourself, exploring the territory that I'd later try to navigate myself many decades past, is at that time in the 1960s and early 70s, the social change efforts weren't led by CEOs. The National Association of Manufacturers, in particular, was quite anti-government and very conservative and pro-war and fighting environmental activity at the time. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce was a very diffuse but also very cautious and rightward-leaning group. But the Business Roundtable was formed then, just over 50 years ago, as a breakaway group of 200 of the largest companies because they thought that we don't have to have society at war with business and that we could find a win-win. There had been efforts earlier that had failed. JFK famously had found that the business community reneged on an agreement and settling a major strike. And JFK said, my dad said you guys were a bunch of SOBs, and he was right, and it didn't get that much better for Johnson. In the Eisenhower years, obviously, there was a great relationship between business and government. Some felt too much so. I actually don't think so. And in fact, business leaders were very active. When people use the term progressive, it's misused even by political scientists today. The progressives, as you're one of the few who would know, among great journalists who would know this, they were the business community. They're very centrist. It was Frederick Winslow Taylor, who was imperfect but still trying to make the workplace a safer place at the turn of the last century. Same with Jane Addams and the immigration reception with the settlement houses and the beautification program and FDR and the conservation movement. That's where the business community was. And the last time this country ran a progressive candidate, It was for presidency. The president was a Republican, the Democrat, and the vice president was a Democrat.
Right.
La Follette and Wheeler were their names, and that's where they were. And then now the Business Roundtable wanted to recapture that, so they were very politically engaged. Foreign Cross Practices Act came from the Business Roundtable. The Superfund Cleanup Business Roundtable is Reginald Jones, Jack Welch's predecessor, coined the term corporate social responsibility. Irving Shapiro of DuPont with the Superfund, and even the Foreign Cross Practices Act. It was the CEO of Raytheon.
But how do you know when to speak out?
Well, that was the message then. Their successors lost their way.
Right.
When Phil Condit of Boeing and others took over the Business Roundtable, they became very defensive, and there was a defense of a lot of corruption and corporate misconduct and greed and the governance failures that we saw, and they were not speaking out about it. But then we have another generation that came out that got very engaged, and they got, but they wait for a catastrophic moment, as when 2020, the 2020 elections, the business community got very involved, and just before that, when President Trump got elected, we'd had him earlier at one of our CEO summits. All the major CEOs that you and I know walked out of the room. They warned me they would if he came in. I was at the Waldorf. And he was introduced by a next tier. When he ran for office, none of them supported him. But when he won, they all rallied around him. And he told me, see, they're all coming now, Jeff. I said, well, why do you think that is? And then they engaged with, but it's when he started to do these one-offs, Ford versus GM and Pfizer versus Merck, and going right along the whole list, they started to realize they needed to speak out in 2017. And in August of 2017, with the Charlottesville murder by the Nazis, and President Trump made an unfortunate statement. It wasn't terrible in the day after the murder, but the next day, for some reason, he not only doubled down, but elevated the Nazis in an equivocation statement. And Ken Fraser, the CEO of Merck, quit, and that led to this unexpected ripple effect. So CEOs found voice at that moment that we hadn't seen in a long time. And then it happened after the elections to reassure who actually won and to celebrate the elections. So CEOs are waiting for catastrophic moments. What I want to know is, where's everybody else? Is that back in the 60s, the CEOs were not at the front of the line. It was the National Council of Churches. It was labor union leaders, trade union leaders, professional associations. They've lost their courage. So CEOs every now and then say, well, we can't be the only ones.
You aren't scared to call folks out, boards and CEOs, when you feel like they're not doing the right thing. Have you gotten blowback?
Not domestically. When we helped immodestly spark what is the high watermark of global corporate values and practice with the roughly 1,200 firms that retreated fairly quickly from Russia after the invasion of a peaceful sovereign nation, of course, being Ukraine, the high watermark before, which I was on the sidelines of, was the South African retreat in 1988. That was very powerful, and sanctions are good. But when the business community spoke, as Bishop Tutu told me, the great apartheid activist, is that the left and the right work together so that the average white South African didn't see themselves as victims, but saw they were pariahs when the business community spoke. So we see that again happen with Russia. Is the blowback I got, once as many as 22 threatened lawsuits in one day. This is now over these last 2 years. It seemed that the smaller, just between us, the European firm was, the more sensitive they were, especially if they were private firms, to transparency and accountability. So that's where we've had the blowback. And sometimes in the Russia situation, we've had some. But I tell you, with the voting stuff, it was shocking to me with voting rights access and the presidential transition, is they came to me and asked if we could organize some meetings as President Trump was interrupted in the airways on the 2 days after the election, proclaiming himself the winner, which was premature and wrong, as it turns out. They wanted to meet. It was a group of 70% Republican. They developed 5 critical talking points on a meeting that they wanted called. I facilitated it. I asked, why don't you use one of these trade groups? And they say, no, they're too bureaucratic and cautious. I think it's because they all have money and reputation to figure I have nothing to lose if it doesn't work. We grouped then on November 7th of 2020 a group that was 65-70% Republican, and they developed talking points as largest election in American history. If anybody, and here's who the winners are. If anybody disputes it, go to the courts. And if they do, fourth, that we want to see clear evidence of fraud, and we don't see it. And fifth, that should be a speedy transfer of power. The very next day, then, every business group used that 5-point statement instead of Bibi Netanyahu and Xi Jinping and Bush 43. And they were very proud. They found their voice at that moment and receded as they should have. And then came time for the awkward, January 6th situation. Things they got it. So it takes a catastrophic moment, but they pick their issues. Like somebody like Michael Dell is tracking 100 issues at any one time. And they're not looking to grab a platform. And this is what most CEOs. What matters most to their constituents, and then they speak out.
Right. I want to ask you about a couple of companies, shifting gears here, Jeff. And I want to be mindful that this is being taped, so it has a shelf life. So I want to be careful we're not out of date here. So speaking broadly about the failures at a company like Boeing, and then the various things that have gone on at the Walt Disney Company. So let's take them one by one. What's happening? What happened wrong at Boeing?
In 2005, they just started outsourcing all kinds of things, like Spirit Aerospace, which shouldn't be an enterprise. It should be a factory. It's making the fuselage. And that's just the biggest of many of the things they outsourced. So now on a Boeing 737, they have in excess of 900 subcontractors, almost 1,000 contractors. So when there are problems with the MCAS system that Collins was creating, or the problems with all these other parts, is there wasn't clear oversight, and it was a cost-driven problem. That was going back then 15, 20 years. Where are we today is I think that Dennis Muhlenberg, who was there at the time of these catastrophic accidents where, 2 planes went down with some 360 fiery deaths, was horrible. He's not a villain. He was being told not to speak out because of the International Regulatory Agency says you can't apologize for what we don't know quite had happened. It was inelegant moments. David Calhoun didn't push him out, did want the job, but did support Muhlenberg when he was there. And Calhoun had been at GE Aviation before that. He took the job. He was eager to take it and his nature is not a beloved one. It's like having a mini Jack Welch. So on the Boeing side, it just was very much of a production-driven culture, not warm and fuzzy, and not safety driven, and not technology driven. So that's a problem there. There are things he needed to do about supply chains, since they're outsourcing too much, things they need to do about safety culture, and a governance problem on their side.
Right. Switching over to Walt Disney, what happened there?
Or
maybe Nelson Peltz happened there.
Nelson Peltz is another one of these octogenarians who I think is not the sort of person to be on the senior circuit in golf, and perhaps he's not great at bingo. I don't know what it is he wanted to do, but he is a failing financier. Is 80% of the companies on whose boards he served have dramatically underperformed the S&P. So he has been impoverishing his investors. But he's always managed to get a good fee out of doing so. And that he had tried before. He's actually tried 25 times to get on the Disney board. Nobody in history has tried 25 times. And he's even sold out a lot of his own shares in Disney unwisely, since the stock is the number one performing stock on the Dow as we speak this year. NVIDIA is not on the Dow, as you know. Number one performing stock on the Dow, which is incredible. It's up 30% as we're meeting today, and Peltz
it's been down over time. That was before that.
Not so well
right.
During the JPEG, during the period of
right.
they had a failed
right.
succession.
Yes.
Now you see.
Is there any failure by the Disney board here? I understand the Nelson Peltz situation, but is there? What happened? Is Bob Iger the only person who can run the company, for instance?
Bob Iger, is he truly messianic? I don't know. He is truly a wizard coming to bring his magic back to the Magic Kingdom, and Peltz or other activists are much more of a parlor illusionist with sleight of hand to distract from their own failed performance. They mischaracterize Disney. Under Bob Iger, there hasn't been 1 month where Bob Iger underperformed everybody in the media world. In his prior stint, and now that he's back again, he's, as we say, up 30% now. And what's Paramount's down 40% as we speak today, and Fox is down 6%. Warner Brothers around 25-30%. He's up, so he's been doing very well. But the board made a mistake with Bob Chapek. He wasn't the right guy for the job. But that happens at a lot of places. So somebody comes back in. I wrote a book about this called The Hero's Farewell. There's a category called The General, whether or not it's Howard Schultz at Starbucks, as you know, or Michael Dell at Dell, or Steve Jobs, of course, at Apple, where they made a mistake in the succession process. But a great hero can return. The Second World War is a triumph of mothballed, retired leaders and led their cause to greater glory. And that's what they're doing with Bob Iger. They're lucky to have him. And they have a wealth of great talent in there now. If something happened to him tomorrow or today, they've got at least 5 people who could step in and be a very successful CEO.
And final question, Jeff, and this one's close to home, which has to do with universities and colleges in America right now, under attack from both the left and the right. What is a college or university president and boards, both? What are they to do? How can they navigate these times?
Well, it's a very important question because we're seeing some people refer to, in a misguided way, something called the Kelvin principles. It came from the University of Chicago. That was to justify their unwillingness to get involved in the anti-war activities of when other colleges like this one at Yale and Berkeley and Notre Dame were very involved in the civil rights movement and environmental movement. Chicago didn't want to then. As it turns out, Chicago takes positions on all kinds of issues. But people and what the Kelvin report says from Chicago is when the university's own core principles are endangered, then they too should speak out. So they don't read it. It's like people think what Milton Friedman said in that 1971 New York Times article is that the only responsibility is the bottom line. He never said the bottom line, and he used the term social amenities for what we call corporate social responsibility, and he spoke about it favorably. But people don't read that. It's So I think it's very important, that we want for universities to say that others in society should speak to social issues and they don't. What we take a look at is basically when Tocqueville came to this country and said, how do we study the legal system here in 1840 and bring it back to France? It wasn't the tightness of the laws, but the looseness. He coined the term social capital, which he said is as valuable as financial capital. When things start to pull apart the fabric of society, you need civic leaders, including university leaders and CEOs, religious leaders, labor union leaders, to speak up. And universities have a role in doing so and should.
Jeff Sonnenfeld, professor of the Yale School of Management, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Andy.
This is at Barrons. I'm Andy Serwer. We'll catch you next time.